So, so we're studying Masechet Bava Mesi'a, and we are up to the third Sugya, and I will be posting the third Sugya soon. But before posting the third Sugya, I wanted to summarize the direction that the Gemara is going in, because when you study Gemara and you study different Sugyot, oftentimes it's easy to lose view of what direction the Hachamim are taking us in. So I want to kind of create this map of the first two sugyot, right? And then we'll go into the third sugya in the next video. But the first sugya deals with the meaning of the Mishnah because there is an apparent redundancy in the Mishnah. So let's review. Two people are grabbing a garment. Reuven says, I found it first. Shimon says, I found it first. Reuven says, it belongs fully to me. Shimon says, no, it belongs fully to me. And then there was a discussion in the Gemara. What is the nature of that redundancy? Why say I found it and it belongs fully to me? So the conclusion of the Gemara is that the Mishnah is dealing with two separate cases. Is a situation where there was an object, hefker, in Reshut Rabim, and they run, they grab it, and the dispute is who grabbed it first, and they come to court, and the Dayanim force them to make a Shavua. If you say you found it first, or you grabbed it first, no problem, make a Shavua. And if they both make a Shavua, you split it 50-50. Okay, very simple halakha. Zeomer Kullah Sheli veZeomer Kullah Sheli is an analogous situation, but it's not identical. Namely, two people enter a store, they see something they like, a fight breaks out, and they give money to the owner. It's not clear to the owner who paid him first, right? And they both come to court and they want the object. So again, we force them to make a shivua. And the shivua is, I paid for it first. And if they're not willing to make the shivua, whoever is not willing to make the shivua, the other side makes the shivua, he will get it. So that's the first sugya. So the first sugya was trying to simply interpret the Mishnah. And one of the primary functions of the Gemara is to explain the Mishnayot, because as noted in the previous classes, the Mishnayot were written in a very dense fashion. So you need the Hachamim in the yeshiva who discuss the meaning of the Mishnah, right? We need their explanation of the Mishnah so that we can understand it. So that's the first sugya. That's a very clear purpose of the Talmud, or one of the clear purposes of the Talmud is the interpretation of the Mishnayot. Fine. The second Mishnah, it starts with the methodology of juxtaposition. And you really need to understand the concept of juxtaposition in order to fully appreciate what the Mishnah is and what the Sugya number 2 is doing. And this is going to be in Sugya number 3 as well. Let me explain to you what juxtaposition is. It's done in art, it's done in literature, where two disparate elements are put together or next to each other, either in a painting or perhaps in a story. And there's a certain tension created between these two disparate elements. Perhaps they complement each other. Perhaps they supplement each other. Perhaps they're in opposition to each other. For example, you have William Shakespeare's play Hamlet. So you have the juxtaposition of Hamlet's contemplative nature, right, on the one side, and then you have impulsive characters like Claudius and Laertes on the other side, right? So you put these contrasting personalities side by side, and in this way we can explore the tension between intellect and action, right? And the ways in which these two forces can complement or conflict with one another. That's in literature. That's done quite a lot in literature. And as I said, it's done in paintings as well. So the second sugya is going to do this juxtaposition between our Mishnah, which deals with the people grabbing the garment, and other Mishnayot, which deal with similar types of situation. And the purpose of the juxtaposition is as follows. Why does our Mishnah impose a shivua upon both sides. That's unusual. Usually, according to the standard legal procedure in court, if there was a plaintiff and there was a defendant, and the plaintiff has a claim against the defendant, generally speaking, more or less, because obviously I'm giving very general rules, but the defendant would be told to make a shivua, right? And based upon that shivua, he would be able to absolve himself from liability posed by the plaintiff's claim, right? Just by way of example, when it comes to court, he says, Shimon owes me $100. Shimon says, no, sir, I only owe you $10. Shimon make a shivua. And if he makes a shivua, he can walk away. What's unusual here is that both sides are grabbing the talet. Who's the plaintiff? Who's the defendant? Well, they're both plaintiffs, but they're both defendants. So they both make a shivua. Interesting. But there is no general rule of shivuot which deals with this type of situation. You see what's unusual about the situation? They're both plaintiffs. They're both defendants. They're both holding the talet, and they're both saying the talet is fully mine. Give me the talet, right? So it's a very interesting situation. So let's look at the cases that are juxtaposed to this Mishnah, okay? So the first case was, give me a moment. I'm using a small Gemara and I need my glasses. I'm not going to bother to get them. Here it is, right? So the first juxtaposition is with respect to the famous case of the storekeeper and the employer and the laborer, right? So the case of the storekeeper, the employer, and the laborer, where the employer tells the storekeeper, do me a favor, I need you to give $100 to my employee. I'll consider that a loan. So it's a loan from the storekeeper to the employer. The employer owes money to his employee. He tells the employee, no problem, go to the storekeeper. He'll give you $100 worth of goods. So money, food, clothing, doesn't matter what. And at the end of the day, the storekeeper says, pay me the $100. I gave your employee the money. The employee says to the employer, pay me my $100. I work for you. And the storekeeper is like, well, the employer is like, well, what do I do? So, well, the answer is the storekeeper has to make a shivua, and he forces, through his shivua, the employer to pay back the money. And the employee can make a shivua, and through his shivua, he forces the employer to pay money. So the employer is going to end up paying twice. He's obviously losing money, right? So that's the case of Kesad Elu Va'elu Va'in Nideh Shivuat Shab. Ben Nanas, he disagrees with that conclusion. The majority opinion is they both make a shivua. Ben Nanas says that doesn't make sense because we know that there's going to be a shivua shaket here. Somebody is lying. Either the storekeeper is lying that he paid the employee, or the employee is lying when he says, I never got paid, right? They can't both be telling the truth. So I want to consider our Mishnah relative to Ben Nanas. Does our Mishnah, with the two people grabbing the garment, is it aligned with Ben Nanas? And the answer is yes. Ben Nanas would conceivably agree that the two people grabbing the garment can each make a shivua. I found it first. How can they make the shivua? Apparently contradictory. But the answer is that they may not be lying. In the case of the storekeeper, he either paid or he didn't pay the employee. That's a blatant lie. Or the employee either got paid or didn't get paid. One of them is clearly lying. In the case of the talet, Ben Nanas would actually potentially agree with our Mishnah, because there's no definite liar. It could be that they both found the talet at the same time. Don't forget, people are running, they're jumping at the talet, maybe they got there together, each one grabbed the talet. maybe they're not lying. So Ben Anas may agree with that. So you see how you have these two contrasting situations. You have the situation, if we may, in the case of the storekeeper, where there's $100 bill, and the storekeeper is pulling on the $100. The employee is pulling on the $100, and the employer has to pay $100 to both of them, right? Meaning or if I could put it another way, it's the employer is holding $100, and both the storekeeper and the employee is grabbing that $100, and they both want it. And the answer is, you both make a shivua, not Hazit, the employer. How can he make a shivua? He has no knowledge. The employee has to make a shivua, he didn't get paid. The storekeeper has to make a shivua that he did pay the employee, and they both grab the $100, and magically or legally, the $100 turns into $200. That's it. You see how the juxtaposition is so brilliant when you compare these two situations. Let's look at the next case. There's a juxtaposition with the case of Sumchus, Mamona Mutat Besafek. So that was a case where we say Lema Matitin Delaka Sumchus, Kid Kesumchus Ha'aman, Mamona Mutat Besafek Holikim Belo Shevuah. So that situation was one where, if you recall, an ox gored a cow. There were witnesses that saw the ox goring the cow. So we've established the liability of the owner of the ox towards the owner of the cow, meaning the owner of the ox must pay the owner of the cow. But there is an issue. And the issue is the cow miscarried, and it's not clear whether the miscarriage took place after the goring and as a result of the goring, or before the goring, and therefore not as a result of the goring. So according to Sumchus, Mamon amutal besafek olekin belo shevuah. There is no shevuah. That's an ambiguous situation. Nobody knows at what point the miscarriage took place. So in the case of Mamon amutal besafek, even though both sides are theoretically grabbing on the dead calf in the sense that the owner of the ox says, I shouldn't be liable for that, right? The owner of the cow says, you should be liable for that. And we say, Mamona mutal besafek holokim belo sheva, according to Sumchus, right? Chachamim. So if I may explain, according to Sumchus, you would split. I'm sorry, and I think I misspoke. I just want to make sure it's clear. According to Sumchus, you would, in a sense, split the dead calf, right? And therefore, you split the liability, whatever the liability is, and however you calculate the liability, but you would split the liability. So just theoretically speaking, let's say the liability caused by the dead calf would be $25, or $24, easier mathematics. So then the owner of the ox would pay $12. So you see how, again, you see the similarity? In the case of the talet, two people are grabbing the talet. Each one says it belongs to me. Here there's a dead calf. Each one wants the value of the dead calf for himself. The owner of the cow says, give me $24. It belongs to me. The owner of the ox says, no, don't take $24 away from me, right? And they're both, so to speak, grabbing on that. And we say, split it 50-50. Now, Sumchus says split it 50-50. And Sumchus says split it 50-50 without a shavua. Apparently that would be misaligned with our Mishnah, because our Mishnah says split the talet 50-50 with the shavua. Sumchus says split the dead calf 50-50 without a shavua. Hachamim disagree with Sumchus. The majority opinion is the majority opinion, namely the opinion of the Hachamim, is no. The owner of the ox doesn't have to pay a cent to the owner of the cow with respect to the dead calf, because there's no evidence. If you want to take something away from somebody, you have to have some proof. Here, there is no proof. So it's mahloket between the majority opinion. Again, the majority opinion is now, would the majority opinion follow our Mishnah, right? So let's read that. 1. So the majority opinion would follow our Mishnah because Hachamim said in the case of the dead calf. Because nobody is in possession of any object, right? Nobody's in possession. There is no possession. Let's say the dead calf, let's say it was worth whatever it was worth, and the liability closed thereby would have been $24, for example. And it depends on whether the ox was shor mu'ad or shor tam. I don't want to get into that now. So let's say the owner of the ox is, so to speak, holding the $24 in his hand, right? And the owner of the cow says, give me that $24. Now, that's not like the case of the talet, because the case of the talet, each one is grabbing one side of the talet. So in that case, the Hachamim say, split the talet 50-50, if they're willing to make a shivua. In the case of the dead calf, the owner of the ox is holding on to that $24, right? The owner of the cow is not holding on to any $24. So there, the Hachamim would say there's no shivua. We're not splitting it 50-50, and there is no shivua because we have the rule, if you want to take something from your fellow, you have to prove it. There is no proof, and therefore the $24 stays with the owner of the ox. Sumchus says, Sumchus disagrees with the majority opinion, and he says, no, split it 50-50, because there's a doubt as to the ownership. But he doesn't require a shavua. So apparently, the opinion of Sumchus disagrees with the opinion of our Mishnah, because Sumchus says split the $24 50-50 without a shavua. Our Mishnah says split the talet 50-50 with a shavua. So there's two explanations. One explanation is that when does Sumchus say Mamona mutal b'safek cholekim below shavua? When does he say split the dead calf 50-50 or the $24 50-50 more appropriately, right? And he says there's no need for a shavua. That would only be in a case where shemeh v'shemeh, meaning the owner of the ox doesn't really know what happened. He doesn't know whether the miscarriage took place before or after the goring. The owner of the cow doesn't really know what's happened. He doesn't know whether it took place before or after the goring. So how can either of them make a shavua? It would be ludicrous to expect them to make a shavua because neither of them is claiming to know what happened, right? So therefore, now you understand what Sumchus is saying. So Sumchus is saying, look, if in the case of the talet, you're going to make them make a shavua, force them to make a shavua, that's because they both know what happened. Sumchus would agree with that. They both know what happened. They're both claiming to have grabbed the talet first. They were there. They know that they grabbed it. So make a shavua, right? You see how the position of Sumchus apparently is beautifully aligned with our Mishnah. Why doesn't he require a shavua in the case of the dead calf? Nobody knows what happened. How can you possibly make a shavua? You can't make a shavua about something you don't know, right? So he says, okay, so split it 50-50 also, but split it 50-50 without a shavua. Really beautiful. You see the juxtaposition, how beautifully it works, and it really illuminates our understanding of the cases. But there was another explanation of Sumchus. According to Rabba bar Avuna, he said that Sumchus's principle or law that you split the money 50-50 without a shavua even applies in a case where both sides have knowledge, right? It's called bari ubari. Bari ubari means both sides say, no, I definitely know for a fact that this is a situation. Even then, Sumchus would say, Mamona mutar b'safek, cholekim belo shavua. Well, if that's the case, then how can you possibly align Sumchus with our Mishnah? Our Mishnah is a case where both sides say, I definitely know what happened, right? And therefore, according to Sumchus, we should split it 50-50. But it should be done so without a shavua. So then the Gemara gave a difficult answer. They said, well, how can we explain why Sumchus would require a shavua in the case of the two sides grabbing the garment? Why would that be? If Sumchus is saying that Mamona mutar b'safek, you have this property, you don't know who owns it, both sides are grabbing it, so to speak, right? And we don't know who owns it, but each side says, I know for sure it's mine. Other side says, I know for sure it's mine. He says, split it 50-50. In the case of the talet, you should split it 50-50. So the answer of the Gemara is, well, look, when does sumchus say mamona mutav l'safek holekim belo shavua? When there's a definite ownership, right? So in the case of the ox, we know who owns the $24 in the hands of the owner of the ox, and we know who owns the calf, who was the owner of the calf that now it's dead, right? It was the owner of the cow or the owner of the dead calf, right? It's clear where the property is, or the ownership of the property. So in that case, because we have that clarity, that's called derara de mamona, sumchus would say, look, split it 50-50. Nobody has to establish themselves as the owner. We already know that they're the owner, right? So split it 50-50 and don't require a shavua in that case. It's redundant. But in the case of the talet, it was found in public. There was no initial point where we can say for sure Reuben owned it, for sure Shimon owned it. It's a complete doubt, right? And therefore, the only way to establish ownership is through the shavua. It's a very subtle point. So you see why sumchus, in the case of the dead calf, he wouldn't require ownership. He wouldn't require shavua because the ownership has already been established. There's a certain doubt as to when the miscarriage took place, which is an important doubt, right? So we say split it 50-50. In the case of the talet, we can't even establish ownership from the beginning. We have no idea. The talet was ownerless, right? It was hefker, right? And therefore, we would say, make a shavua to establish ownership in the first place. But it's still, that's a weak explanation. And the Gemara notes that it's a weak explanation. It says, look, if in the case where you have definite ownership, you're saying there's no need for shavua to impose a shavua. In a case where you don't even know ownership on either side, why would you do that? It doesn't make sense, right? So no, we don't know who the owner is, so let's establish ownership. But you don't know ownership on either side, so just split it 50-50. Why make a shavua? So really, it's very difficult to explain our Mishnah in accordance with sumchus, and that's where the Gemara comes to the conclusion that this shavua, in the case of the garment, is a special takanat hachamim. It doesn't follow the standard laws. So you see, the conclusion is going to be this shavua, in the case of the garment, stands in opposition to other analogous situations, right? Hachamim established a special rule in the case of a talet found in public, where both people are claiming, I grabbed it first. Hachamim said, in this specific case, we have a special law, which is in opposition to other similar situations. And that special law is both sides have to make a shavua. And what's the reason for that? The reason for that is because otherwise it would be chaos. We would turn into San Francisco under the woke leadership. People go in, they grab from the stores, everybody takes whatever they want, right? Just take under $900 or under $1,000, whatever it is, and you're okay. You're good to go. What was that? What was the kidding aside? What was the concern of the Hakamim? I find the garment there. I find it and I grab it. Somebody saw that I found the garment. He said, I saw that first. I say, tough luck, I got it. I'm holding it. He comes and he grabs it from me. Right? Now, if he didn't have to make a shavua, we'd both be coming to court. What's he going to tell the judges? I found it first. I'm going to tell the judges that's a lie. I found it first. He's going to say, no, you're lying. I found it first. Doesn't care. He doesn't have to make a shavua. He knows that he's going to come to court, and just by virtue of the fact that he's grabbing the garment, he's going to get 50% of it. Great deal, right? Woke policies says no. So that's why the Chachamim, they said make a shavua. Because we don't want people to come into court and just to lie and get away with holding 50% or, getting 50% of something. So that's why we said, make a shavua, because a person might be willing to lie, but he wouldn't be willing to make a false shavua, right? Similar to the woke policies in San Francisco. A person might be willing to walk into a store and grab $900 worth of things. He knows he's not going to jail. But if you know he was going to jail, he's not going to grab $900 worth of things. It's not worth it. So in conclusion, the second sugya rather, the purpose was to juxtapose our Mishnah with the two people grabbing the garment to two other analogous situations. One situation, again, the storekeeper, employer, employee, right? Where on one side, the employer is grabbing the $100, and the other side, the storekeeper and the employee are grabbing the $100, right? That was one juxtaposition. And then the other was comparing our Mishnah with the garment to people grabbing a garment to the case of the dead calf. The cow was gored by the ox. How do we deal with the value of the dead calf? We saw the opinion of Sumchus. We saw the majority of the opinion, which was which illustrates the fact that here in our case, both sides are defendants and plaintiffs on the same side at the same time, right? And this leads logically into the Takanat Hachamim. You see that thinking the Hachamim, both sides are plaintiffs, both sides are defendants, usually, but not always. It's the plaintiff forces the defendant to make shivu'ah, and if the shivu'ah of the defendant, if he makes it, he can generally walk away, usually, right? But we saw the employee is not like that. The employee can force his employer, right? Even though the employee is the plaintiff, right? That's an exception. But the point being that you see the logic of the Hachamim. Here, both sides are plaintiffs at the same time, and they want the guy to let go of the talet. So we tell both sides, make a shivu'ah. And it follows a very intelligent policy. We don't want to turn into San Francisco under a woke administration. We want to prevent chaos in the streets. So that was the second sugya. The third sugya is going to employ the methodology of juxtaposition for a different purpose. We just studied the laws of Shivu'ah, and we understand how the laws of Shivu'ah work. The third sugya is going to do something very interesting. It's going to look at a Mishnah in the third chapter of Masechet Bava Mesi'a, where there was a bailment. Two people together come. There's one sack of money for the two of them, and they give it to the bailee. And then later on, there's a dispute. Who owes? The dispute was, we understand what the full amount of the money was, of course, whatever was in the bag, but there's a dispute as to who owns what percentage of the money in the bag. There'll be the third sugya. We will discuss that soon, or at least in the next class.